exploring. Let me bring in Ron Insana in the meantime. He's a financial journalist, author of the Substack Message of the Market. Speaking of markets, Ron, we're not seeing much of a reaction. Why do you think that is?
Well, we're seeing a lot of volatility this morning, Anna, for a wide variety of reasons. Like the Supreme Court decision itself, we have a multiplicity of headlines that are affecting financial markets, not only this decision and its attendant implications, but also we had slower than expected fourth quarter economic growth. GDP expanded at a 1.4% annual rate that was knocked down by the government shutdown. It would have been a little bit stronger had that not occurred. An inflation data item that came out this morning was also higher than expected. So you have this real kind of whipsaw activity going on in the stock market, less so in other markets. And then now there's this kind of, as Lisa and your other guests are having to do, reading through the fine print of the Supreme Court decision to determine what happens next. Will the administration use Section 232 or Section 301 tariffs that are used either for national security reasons or for harm to the economy? Will they replace the IEEPA tariffs with those, which, by the way, are more temporary and less severe than the IEEPA tariffs? Will the government have to refund money to individual businesses as a consequence? How do they do that? So again, just like as you are all sitting there trying to read through this, the market's doing the same thing and really has yet to make, I think, reach a conclusion as to what it means overall. From my perspective, on the one hand, it's good news because if the tariffs were in fact rolled back, it would take some pressure off inflation. As you know, and the White House criticized this report just the other day, the New York Federal Reserve said that 90% of the cost of the tariffs that have been imposed under IEEPA have been borne by U.S. businesses and consumers. The White House was critical of that. Kevin Hassett, who's the president's top economic advisor, said those Federal Reserve economists should be disciplined from arriving at that conclusion, even though other people have arrived at the very same conclusion.
Right.
So it does reduce some pressure on inflation if indeed the tariffs were rolled back. But we'll have to wait and see, as you've all been saying, as to how the White House responds.
I mean, let me underscore what you just said, and that is this most recent report that came out within the last week from the New York Fed saying 90% of the tariffs that have been imposed here have been paid for by consumers and businesses here in the U.S. So what kind of a hit has the American economy taken because of this, Ron? And has the revenue generated lined up with what the president had been initially touting?
No, I mean, at one point he got as high as $600 billion in annualized revenue from the tariffs. It's closer, we believe, to about $150 billion or so. It has had an effect on inflation, as stated. It's also had, to a certain extent, a depressive impact on growth. And it's also rerouted trade around the world as our trading partners are making new deals because of the, let's call it, unfriendly nature of these impositions, that we've seen, Canada reach out to China. We've seen Europe reach out to China. We've seen other countries try to form new trade alliances that either not fully exclude the United States, of course, being the biggest economy in the world, but become less dependent on it as a consequence of this. So there are a lot of moving parts here. And, again, it's affecting global trade flows. Imports for much of the year were down. Exports weren't up all that much from the United States, as we don't have a lot of buyers. In fact, the exports that we saw increase that we saw, I should say, largely was the result of us sending gold overseas. And the trade deficit itself, which the president said would shrink dramatically just the other day, said it was down 78%. It went from $903 billion to $901 billion in 2025. It was down 0.002%.
So, Ron, if there are refunds coming, and we don't know that, it sounds like, if that's going to happen, who decides who gets the refunds, and how complicated will it be to backtrack on all of this?
I think it's probably, it will have to play through the courts a little bit because there is no real previously designated entity that would make a decision. Now, obviously, the U.S. Customs Service, collects the tariffs and then distributes those to the Treasury. I'm not quite sure what the mechanism would be. And I think companies would have to deal with this, and so would the government, on a case-by-case basis. How much of the tariff did they pay? How much did consumers pay? What are they entitled to in terms of refunds relative to what's been imposed? And do they fall under the IEEPA statutes, or were some of the tariffs that have been implemented through other means going to be excluded from that pot of money? So there's really a lot to comb through here. And it's very difficult to say exactly how this will be adjudicated and how ultimately companies will be benefiting from this or get refunds from this. Consumers, very unlikely to see any of this coming back to them. I think that would be a near impossibility to determine how much each consumer paid in terms of excess costs for a wide variety of goods. And so how do you then, offer, $1.80 to a consumer or some number that they can't really be teased out in all of this. So businesses may get refunds. Again, if this is the way it works out, consumers probably won't see the benefit, except in the longer run, if the tariffs were to be removed, in which case prices could come down in some instances noticeably.
Yeah, Ron, President Trump has previously said if a president is not allowed to use tariffs, that will be at a major disadvantage against all the other countries throughout the world. That is a quote from him. Why would that be the case? Are we at a disadvantage?
No, not in the least. I mean, the president certainly does have tariff powers under Section 232, again, which affects specific industries, under Section 301, which is national security. I may have confused those two. But the president can impose tariffs for, in some instances, limited period of time, 150 days, for instance, and put those tariffs on in order to address issues, again, that are either focused on national security or that threaten the viability of certain critical industries in the United States. Temporary, they're not the same as the IEEPA tariffs or his attempt to use IEEPA to impose tariffs. And again, the president, with this kind of 19th century mentality about tariffs, has suggested on multiple occasions that this is an enormous benefit for the U.S. economy. We know from the growth rates, we know from inflation rates, that it's really not had a salutary impact on the U.S. economy. We know it hasn't done what the president said it would do, which would make us infinitely richer, that would pay down the debt, that would get the White House or the Treasury or Congress or whomever to send $2,000 tariff checks to every individual in the United States or something along those lines. It just simply doesn't achieve those goals. And quite frankly, the economy was doing better without them. So he has, on many occasions, overstated the impact of tariffs on the economy as being a massive benefit to them. Again, citing the period from between 1870 to 1913, in which there was no income tax, and our revenues to the federal government largely consisted of tariffs, excise taxes, and sales taxes and the like. So, again, he's created a narrative that's just not supported by the data. And were the tariffs to be taken off, they would actually benefit the economy more than destroy it, as the president also has claimed.
There was this report, data released by the Census Bureau just this week, that showed we had the largest trade deficit in goods, hitting a record high in the past year. And that is even when you had all of these tariffs in effect. So that just goes to show, when the president argues that as the reason for bringing this national emergency was the trade deficit, the tariffs did not actually reverse that.
Reporting on this Trump defeat at the Supreme Court today. 6 justices striking down these tariffs. It's a clear blow to what we know is a clear and major economic priority for President Trump. The High Court nixing Trump's tariffs. All of this is important and lands as a path to potentially a wider check on the president's efforts to seize emergency powers. That ranges from trade, the subject of this case, to potentially military policing, and a lot more in this MAGA era. This ruling is obviously a setback for Trump. It is the most sweeping rejection of Trump's attempted power grabs from the Supreme Court that we've seen his entire second term. It's driving headlines tonight about both the obvious economic importance, trimming billions in international tariffs, and the wider pushback to Trump's efforts at a more unilateral, or some say king-like, presidency. Now, later tonight, I'm going to give you a detailed breakdown on what the court's rebuke means, especially going forward. Right now, we begin with the seismic news landing across the nation.
An increasingly rare directive from the Supreme Court. It told Donald Trump no.
A major slap at the president of the United States.
It is fundamentally a reversal of the president's position.
It's a conservative court, and Trump doesn't often lose, does he?
The court said, look, you can't make a sow's ear into a silk purse.
Would you say that he lost this one? He did,
He did lose. He did.
This decision is a loss for the administration.
This is an enormous decision and a rare loss for President Trump.
Reinforcing the separation of powers enshrined in the U.S. Constitution.
The ruling is about power more than economics. It reinforces the limits on any president's power, including this president. The Chief Justice dealing Trump a clear defeat. Under law, the power to authorize tariffs in peacetime is constitutionally vested in Congress alone, we saw today. Now, Trump could have avoided today's loss had he simply worked with Congress on the raft of tariffs he famously announced. Of course, Congress is run by his Republican Party. And while he relished the spotlight in rolling those tariffs out, plus the uncertainty he sometimes stoked, announcing those tariffs, standing alone on the world stage, threatening other countries, even if often later backing down, today he stood alone in a very different way, in defeat. He came out to face reporters and cameras as he railed against a clear loss. He acknowledged the limit on his powers by discussing what could be other paths to temporary tariffs he might push, but not for long without Congress under this ruling. All of this comes after Trump has faced several losses on the issue in the lower courts. And this big news also vindicates the Americans who sued to stop Trump from what they said exceeded his power, as well as the legal strategy of their well-known advocate, Obama's former top Supreme Court litigator, and a frequent voice on our air. Neil Katyal joins us now. I want to play what he told the court in the arguments, some of which are now reflected in the new ruling today.
This president has torn up the entire tariff architecture. That is just not something that any president has ever had the power to do in our history. And the idea that Congress, by implication, did this in 1977 and handed him all this power, I think is really difficult.
Neil, your view of today's ruling?
Well, thank you, Ari, for having me on. And yes, I mean, I think I asked the Supreme Court for about 6 things in my oral argument on November 5th. And the Supreme Court gave us each one and gave it to us resoundingly, both in clear language written by the Chief Justice in the majority opinion and also in separate opinions. And notably, Ari, you know, this was a decision joined by 2 appointees of Donald Trump himself, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, joining the Chief Justice, who's itself a Republican appointee, and others on the court to say, not under our Constitution, you don't get to do this. And we had thought, you know, going into today, we felt very good about our arguments, but nonetheless, we expected the president to somehow spin it as a win, because he does that in other realms, but he couldn't spin this one. I mean, the Supreme Court was unequivocal and clear. He went way beyond the constitutional parameters, and the Supreme Court reined him in appropriately.
Mm-hmm. In the ruling, we have a description of what was Trump's position, as argued by DOJ, that if he had his way, he'd have the power to unilaterally impose unbounded tariffs, change them at will. They note in the law's half-century, no president has invoked the statute to impose any tariffs, let alone tariffs of this magnitude. How did you view what the court today says was extremism? Not some debatable thing, as we sometimes have in court, but what they viewed as the president, and by extension the DOJ's defense, as a kind of extremism that could not stand?
Yeah, that's exactly why we were confident, Ari, in our position. It wasn't about President Trump. It was about the positions that the president had taken on tariffs, which were just so radical. I mean, if you go back over American history, I think you can count on one hand the number of times a president loses a major case. Normally courts defer to the president. You may not even have many fingers on that hand, quite honestly. It's incredibly rare. And we knew that going in. We knew that in order to win this challenge, we had to persuade the court not just that it was like minorly unconstitutional, but a major betrayal of our constitutional conscience. We thought that's what it was. I think the questions at oral argument, which were super hard, it was a really intense oral argument in November. They gave me a very hard time, to be sure. But I think the questions really pointed to the court thinking, yeah, this is well beyond anything any other president has done, and we can't tolerate it here.
Yeah, and in our system of government, the president has big powers. People know that. Some of the members of this court have been associated with the view that that's a good thing, that you need a kind of clear, active, almost sometimes brash executive. It can't be second-guessing everything or worried about everything being litigated. And so I'm curious about that arc of jurisprudence against what Chief Justice Roberts wrote today, which you know, and I'll read to viewers, the president's assertion of a broad statutory power over the national economy, basically the way he wanted to conduct the trade war without Congress, was, quote, extravagant by any measure. Can you talk to us about that line, how you argued it, but also the majority you found for that line, that sure, he's got big powers, but not this big alone.
Exactly. I mean, one of the hard things when you're a Supreme Court advocate fighting against a presidential claim of power is the president is saying, look, I really need this court. And like, who are you as some, private person? Here I had the privilege of representing, 5 small businesses. But who are they to second guess a president's determination? Well, I really need this. And that's what makes a challenge like this very hard. At the same time, we do live under a constitution. And the most important thing our founders did was say the power to tax is the power to destroy, and therefore it's got to be lodged in the Congress of the United States. And indeed, in Article 1 of our Constitution, the power to impose tariffs is given to Congress, and it's the first power Congress is given. And so they really made that clear. And so our whole litigation strategy was to really emphasize that and to say, look, separation of powers and waiting for legislation might be cumbersome, it might take time, but that is the American way. And I closed both my brief to the Supreme Court and my oral argument on November 5th with the same quote from Justice Jackson back in the Steele seizure case in 1952, in which he made that point. And today I was really glad to see Justice Gorsuch, again, one of Donald Trump's own appointees, picking that up. And the last paragraphs of his opinion are written as beautifully as anything I've seen in the United States reports. And it's all about that kind of need for legislation, for Congress to do its job, and for the president to have the inability to cut them out of the equation.
Let's go right to MS Now's legal affairs reporter, Fallon Gallagher, at the Supreme Court. Also with us, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, MS Now legal analyst Catherine Christian, and Duncan Levin, a former federal prosecutor. Fallon, give us a recap here. What did the court say?
Yeah, Anna, this is a massive blow for the president's agenda. Tariffs, of course, being one of his signature policies, and the Supreme Court saying that the president cannot use IEEPA to unilaterally impose these tariffs. Now, of course, the tariffs at question in this case came from 5 different executive orders targeting a number of countries, but the Supreme Court is saying that the president does not have the authority to do this. Now, the vote breakdown here was 6-3, with Justice Roberts writing the majority opinion. That's not surprising. Typically, the Chief Justice will reserve that majority opinion in the trickiest of cases for himself, and Justice Thomas leading in the dissents. But what's really notable here is that there are 7 written opinions. That's because a number of justices wrote the majority, concurrences, and various dissents. The only 2 justices who didn't write separate opinions were Justices Alito and Justice Sotomayor. Now, the key difference here in between these opinions and the various concurrences and why they believed the president doesn't have this authority mostly relies on the major questions doctrine. Now, that means that the Congress has to explicitly give the president authority to do certain things, and the Supreme Court here finding that Congress has not given the president the authority to unilaterally impose tariffs, that is instead a taxation power that reserved for Congress. Most notably, though, in the dissent, Justice Thomas seems to argue that the major questions doctrine does not apply here, that the president should be able to unilaterally impose tariffs without any sort of limitation. The other big thing in this opinion is the question of refunds. Now, this is a question that had come up in oral arguments. Justice Barrett hinted at it about how difficult this might be in a practical sense. This opinion does not appear to really lay out a specific mechanism for how practically these refunds can happen. In fact, the only place where I've seen the mention of refunds so far is in Kavanaugh's dissent, where he points out how difficult this is going to be from a practical standpoint. And I want to remind you that while this litigation has been ongoing, those tariffs have been allowed to remain in effect. And that could be one of the reasons why the Supreme Court took this case up so quickly, moving it from the emergency docket to the merits document, hearing arguments rather quickly, and ruling rather early in the term, because the longer this goes on, the higher that amount is going to become. And I believe Secretary Bessent had estimated that by June, when the Supreme Court typically issues decisions, that amount could be $1 trillion. So the earlier opinion is going to be critical here. And I know we've been talking for weeks, when is this going to come? When is this going to come? I've stood outside court on a number of days where we didn't get this opinion. This is relatively early considering how complex this is. I cannot tell you a time in recent memory where I've seen 7 written opinions from these justices. Anna?
Fallon, great job breaking it down for us. Thank you for bringing us that reporting. Lisa, it sounds like a complicated decision. As she points out, 7 different decisions here, although, again, it was 6-3 when it came to the bottom line, and that is overruling the president's tariffs, those sweeping tariffs that he had invoked the Emergency Powers Act to invoke. Can you talk to me about, we all sat here, of course, on the day of the oral arguments. Based on what you're reading, are there any surprises yet?
There are not a ton of surprises. I think one surprise for me is just the court's failure to address the pragmatics, which was clearly weighing on the minds of some of the justices at oral argument. Amy Coney Barrett, as someone mentioned earlier, was very focused on, well, if you do this, how do you untangle the results for small business owners, for the American consumers, et cetera? And she seemed to be very focused on that. And yet, Justice Barrett not only doesn't write on her own behalf here, but the court as a whole isn't answering that question. I want to read to you, Fallon referred to it a few moments ago, from Justice Kavanaugh's dissent, where he really takes the majority to task for its failure to wrestle with some of the really complicated fallout from this. He says, the court's decision is likely to generate other serious practical consequences in the near term. One issue will be refunds. Refunds of billions of dollars would have significant consequences for the U.S. Treasury. The court says nothing today about whether, and if so, how the government should go about returning the billions of dollars that it has collected from importers. But that process is likely to be a, quote, mess, end quote, as was acknowledged at oral argument. And then he goes on to talk about another practical problem here. A second issue is the decision's effect on the current trade deals, meaning the trade deals that the administration has struck all around the world. He says because IEEPA, and that's the statute here that the president was relying on, tariffs have helped facilitate trade deals worth trillions of dollars, including with foreign nations from China to the United Kingdom to Japan. The court's decision could generate uncertainty regarding various trade agreements. That process, too, could be difficult. And that, of course, is understatement from Justice Kavanaugh in that moment. Those two problems, as well as the question of whether the president will now try to justify tariffs under a variety of different other statutory options. Justice Kavanaugh counts 5 in his dissent. Those are going to be sort of the practical fallout from this decision that policymakers, as well as business owners and consumers all over this country, are going to be dealing with in the coming weeks and months. And of course, the court is silent as to those things. It may not think it was its role to decide them, but its failure to offer any clarity about what should happen is one of the things that's going to be most challenging in the wake of this opinion, Anna.
Yeah, so how do those next steps work?
It's
Catherine?
not shocking to me when a court says, you can't do this, but they don't tell you. It's basically, now you figure out how you're supposed to do it the right way. That's not shocking to me. They don't want to get involved in policy. This came up in oral argument. In fact, it was Justice Barrett who made a point, and she's with the majority today saying the president cannot unilaterally impose tariffs. So it's not shocking to me. There appears to be, and I agree, Senator Warren is quoted as, there appears to be no legal mechanism to get the money back, the people who, to recoup the tariffs that were already paid. So, you know, that's just going to be out there. I guess for the people who had to pay tariffs, at least they won't have to pay anymore unless the administration comes with another way to do it. And I guarantee you that will end up back in the Supreme Court, too, if it's done unlawfully.
And just kind of closing the loop on a question I asked very early on, when it goes back to the lower courts, what's their role at this point?
Well, this I misstated before. It's just sent back to the lower court to dismiss it finally. So it says remanded back to the district court to dismiss because of lack of jurisdiction. So that this particular case is over, but it might come back in a different form.
Duncan, what does this ruling signal about the court's independence from President Trump? And does John Roberts now become Trump's latest foe?
Well, he may become President Trump's latest foe, but I actually don't think this decision has much to say at all about President Trump in particular. It really, for anyone who's been dealing with some of these issues with IEEPA, and I know the American public is just coming to learn the words IEEPA and what it is, the statute itself has a long history that precedes it from the early 1910s when presidents were given this power to regulate trading with the enemy. There's this act called the Trading with the Enemy Act. And the power was expanded in the 1930s to allow presidents to regulate trading with the enemies during national emergencies. The president at that time, FDR, who was dealing with the Great Depression, used it as a way to regulate some finances with gold and other national emergencies. And over time, it came to be used by presidents to regulate all sorts of trading emergencies, national emergencies. And when Watergate came around in the 1970s, Congress actually passed IEPA, this International Emergency Economic Powers Act, as a way to take power away from the presidency, not to give the president more power. And so as a way of doing that, they said you can declare national emergencies and use it, for example, to block property and freeze assets, prohibit transfers. It's been used by presidents for all sorts of things like freezing Iranian assets, sanctioning Russian oligarchs, restricting North Korean trade. But the guardrails that Congress put on it in the 1970s were meant to take power away from the presidency. So really, this is not about President Trump. It's not about President Nixon. It's really about separation of powers. And I don't think that there's any kind of animus here from the Supreme Court. This is really looking at the statute, the history of the way it was used. And it's the Supreme Court's way of saying what this power that was granted to the presidency through IEPA wasn't broad enough to include taxation. The words taxation don't appear in it. The words, block and nullify and prohibit, those are words that appear in IEPA. Those are coercive tools that are aimed at foreign actors. And the difference is not just semantic, it's a constitutional difference.
It may not be a direct message to the president. However, this is his signature policy. And Lisa, some of the justices this president handpicked ruled against him.
Yeah, but that happens across presidencies. If you take sort of a broader historical view, this president likes to believe that his justices should be working for him. Mm-hmm. But that is not a view that bears itself out over the course of history by and large. You see justices disappoint the presidents that nominated them all the time. I think David Souter is a great example of somebody who was pitched as a classic conservative when he was nominated and yet turned out to be very different on the bench. So, yes, the president may take this to be some form of betrayal by those that he nominated to the court. And yet, I don't think this will be the first or the last time that some of these folks are going to disappoint him in that regard. Anna, I want to go back to your question, if I can, about what was surprising here, because there's another nugget of a surprise of sorts. In Justice Gorsuch's concurrence, there is a paragraph that he wrote that sounds almost as if he's writing a message to the American people about the importance of Congress and the legislative process, something we don't talk a lot about right now because Congress isn't actually doing much legislating at all. And he writes that most major decisions affecting the rights and responsibilities of the American people, including the duty to pay taxes and tariffs, are funneled through the legislative process for a reason. Yes, legislating can be hard and take time. And yes, it can be tempting to bypass Congress when some pressing problem arises. But the deliberative nature of the legislative process was the whole point of its design. Through that process, the nation can tap the combined wisdom of the people's elected representatives, not just that of one faction or man. And he goes on. But that, to me, strikes me as Gorsuch basically saying to Congress, hey, guys, you have a job to do, and you maybe should remember how to do it, but also telling the American people it's not normal for most policy decisions to be made from the White House, from Pennsylvania Avenue. The whole structure of our constitutional system was predicated on Congress being the policy actors, and you should take them and their responsibilities seriously. You should hold them to that as well.
The Supreme Court strikes down Trump's signature policy. He has a meltdown in the White House briefing room. And I just want to know what was going through your mind as you watched it all unfold today?
Well, it was unhinged. I mean, watching his press conference today, where he just, as you pointed out, I mean, he just fell apart about this and attacked Supreme Court justices and could not understand why he could not wield this power that he believes is his, that has now been found unconstitutional. So, and what does he do? He turns to yet another statute that allows tariffs in certain circumstances, and now he intends to reimpose these tariffs that are truly devastating small businesses. They're hurting families across my state. And as you saw, $1,700 per family. These are working families, $1,700. Remember, this is the guy who lowered taxes on the wealthiest people, and he raised taxes, the tariff taxes, on the middle class, the working class, and frankly, people, just everyday folks going to the grocery store, just buying goods. let me just tell you one other thing. The farmers, these are folks mostly who voted for Donald Trump. He has devastated, for example, the soybean farmers in my state. As a result of his tariffs and the way he has activated trade wars, we no longer are selling soybeans to the Far East. And that's billions of dollars of sales for family farmers across the state of Illinois. So the $1,700 doesn't even talk about the small businesses and the farmers that are hurt by what he was doing and now wants to reimpose.
No question about it. And I mean, I showed this invoice earlier. You basically said Illinois wants their money back, $1,700 per family. We already know that a lot of businesses who have paid the tariffs have already hired lawyers to try to sue the government to get the money back. So explain to us, in your view, kind of how this could happen, what should happen, and how could this happen? How could people out there watching get any money recouped?
Well, if he actually gave a darn about working families, he would just institute the rebates that people should get. These refund checks should just come. That's what he should do. He won't do it because he actually doesn't care about working families, and he thinks he's right. And so he's going to hold on to that money. And the result of that is that, think about the small business that just wants to get their money back. It's going to take them, it may be years that they're in court trying to get this money back. Meanwhile, he's reimposing tariffs, so it's getting worse for people. It's so damaging to the U.S. economy, and you saw the effects of that last year. We had the lowest job growth in a very long time as a result of Donald Trump taking over as president and what he's done to the economy with tariffs.
And Scott Bessent is almost gleeful about it. I don't know if you saw this because you're busy, you're governing a state, but it seems like your invoice has at least gotten under the Trump gang's skin a bit, because Stephen Miller, of all people, was asked about this request of yours tonight on Fox News. So I just want to play this for you, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
J.B. Pritzker, though, is pretty happy because he thinks now the federal government should return $1,700 per Illinois family because the tariffs were struck down.
Well, Governor Pritzker is not only economically illiterate, historically illiterate, and probably functionally illiterate, but he is also somebody whose every action and policy is designed to hurt and betray America.
I mean, I felt like Stephen Miller was about to jump out of his skin there. There was a lot there, but you're clearly under their skin. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I thought I was just living rent-free in the president's head. Apparently, I'm living rent-free in Stephen Miller's head, too. All I can say is, I mean, remember, he's done more to damage this country with his unconstitutional recommendations to the president, the attacks on families and people, everyday people across the United States with ICE and CBP. And frankly, moms getting shot in the face because of Stephen Miller. So honestly, I just don't take anything he says about me seriously. I take very seriously, though, the impact that he's having on the country in such a terribly negative way. So look, he doesn't seem to understand that $1,700 out of the pockets of everyday people across the United States is a lot of money. And the damage that they're doing is that people are not earning more. People are losing jobs as a result of Donald Trump. And they now have had to pay $1,700 that they're apparently not going to get back because they're going to have to fight in court to get it and may never get it. And now they're reimposing these tariffs that everybody knows harming the U.S. economy.